This question is for Dan McClellan.
All right, Britt, let's see it.
I was wondering if you could tell me more about heroic Eve and the strands in Judaism and Christianity that support the idea that Eve was leaving innocence for more knowledge and becoming more like God, which was a positive thing. I know there are some Jewish mystical and philosophical strands, especially in Kabbalah, that reframe the tree of knowledge as a necessary step in kind of our spiritual evolution. But what I don't know is like how pervasive were these theories and how heretical were they considered by contemporaries in their time. The context for this question is that I'm turning 40 and I went to get a tattoo consultation, and I was explaining this tattoo that I wanted because I love this idea of reclaiming Eve. And the guy who was wanting to do my tattoo said that he wouldn't do it because it would be celebrating sin. And I tried to explain that, the Gnostic texts look at Eve differently, or, Christian mystics and Jewish mystics, but I wasn't really able to express, how heretical that view was considered. I don't really have a sense for that, so I wondered if you could answer that question. And as always, congrats on the book and keep up the good work.
Hey, thank you for a great question, Britt. I'm sorry you had to go through an experience like that with a tattoo artist, somebody engaged in a profession that I think the majority of Christians, for the majority of the history of Christianity, would have considered sinful, which has really only been overcome within the last few generations as tattoos have become more popular, more secular, less controversial, and Christians have renegotiated their relationship with tattoos and what the Bible says about that. I got my tattoo when I was 19 in Deep Ellum in Dallas. It's a little tribal design that I drew that's in between my shoulder blades, and there certainly wouldn't have been anyone in that tattoo shop that would have had any issue at all with an Eve tattoo. But to address your question, I think you've mentioned the two main groups in the ancient and medieval and pre-modern world that would have endorsed something like a heroic Eve concept. Obviously, there's a spectrum of ways this can be understood, all the way from Eve did something wrong, but it was a result of curiosity or something like that, all the way up to Eve was inspired by divine wisdom, and this was a way to liberate humanity from the demiurge. So within Christianity, the Gnostic literature is the main place where you're going to find a heroic Eve, and it, again, has different shapes and different contours and things like that, depending on the text, depending on if it's Sethian or Valentinian or anything like that. And obviously, the Gnostic literature was very popular with more mystical strands of Christian thought up until the 4th and 5th centuries, when it became demonized and marginalized by the central church institution. And this is the pattern that you're going to find. To the degree a tradition has a centralized hierarchy, the notion of a heroic Eve is probably going to conflict with the rhetorical goals and the structuring of power of that hierarchy. That's certainly true about Christianity once it's arrogated imperial power. I think to a lesser degree that's true of Judaism. I think mystical Judaism was able to survive and spread more because Judaism didn't have as much of a centralized authority structure. But it still was probably on the outs with the most influential voices within Judaism in the medieval and later periods. And then outside of Gnosticism and mystical Judaism, it begins to bubble to the surface again within the scholarship that begins with Renaissance humanism and then develops in the 19th and 20th centuries. So you had some Renaissance scholars who were arguing for a more egalitarian approach to understanding the role of women in the Garden of Eden, in the scriptures, and then you have later scholars within Jewish and Christian traditions who are doing very similar things. Phyllis Tribble, God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality, for instance, is a good discussion that tries to kind of reclaim Eve, and then also Judith Plaskow's The Coming of Lilith does a very similar thing from a Jewish perspective. And I think one of the main problems with the traditions that have that centralized authority structure is the fact that that reading kind of conflicts with the New Testament and with other texts that are reflecting on what's going on in the Garden of Eden. You have 1 Timothy 2:14, I think it is, where the person pretending to be Paul says that it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman who was deceived and became a transgressor as a result. And that hierarchy is going to give priority to the passages that support its structuring of power, which was very patriarchal by the 4th, 5th centuries CE. And so the passage that says that the women screwed up is going to take priority over an interpretation of the Garden of Eden story that says, hey, maybe Eve was on to something. But you will still have around the periphery of a lot of Christian and Jewish traditions today, folks trying to reclaim something for Eve. And I think there's something to that as well within the story of the Garden of Eden. I think if we never had any other biblical texts, if we just had Genesis 2 and 3, we would probably understand God to be a bit of an antagonist, a villain who is trying to stop humanity from progressing. And it's natural for humans to want to overcome their shortcomings, want to overcome their limits. And I think we would need to sympathize. And also, as I have talked about on my channel many times, the serpent is not really lying in the story of the Garden of Eden. If anyone is lying, it would have to be God, who threatens Adam with death on the very day he eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then Adam doesn't die on that very day. So I think the traditional dichotomy of good and evil and what's going on in the Garden of Eden has always been contextualized and negotiated through the interpretive lenses of later understandings of the significance of this event, later treatments of this notion of a fall, which is common to Christianity but not really common to Judaism, and Paul's representation of Eve as the woman who was deceived, at least in the pseudo-Pauline text. So there's a lot going on there. I think it probably was considered pretty heretical by the folks who were in positions of power within Christianity particularly, but also within Judaism. But it is something that has come to the fore in the last few centuries as a result of attempts to renegotiate what's going on in the text, to interpret the text through more egalitarian perspectives that don't try to demonize or vilify a human for doing what humans do. So I would say that tattoo artist is taking their tradition more seriously than they are taking the text of the Bible, but that's also probably why they don't have a problem with being a tattoo artist. And I think that's a good thing, but in that negotiation, I think people need to take more seriously the question of whose interests are being elevated, whose interests are being marginalized or ignored. And if they think critically about that, I think they're going to see there's a lot more harm that results from that kind of maintenance of those power structures than there is good. And that, in and of itself, would kind of be celebrating sin in a way. So thank you for a wonderful question. I hope that was somewhat helpful. I don't know that I provided any information that you didn't already have, but that's my thoughts on the matter. And the fit for this video has been the Avengers.